welcome to the Philosopher's Compass podcast. I am your host, Meredith Alexander Kunz. I'm the creator of the Stoic Mom Substack, helping parents and kids benefit from Stoic philosophy. And I'm also the co-author of the book Beyond Stoicism, in the UK, Live Like a Philosopher. I launched this podcast to focus on how people are using practical philosophy, especially Stoicism, in their everyday lives, and how they're using it to improve finding purpose and meaning and how they live, essentially. Today, I'm really fortunate to have as my guest Donald J. Robertson. Donald is a psychotherapist and an author, and he is one of the founders of the Modern Stoicism nonprofit. He is also the founder and president of the Plato's Academy Center in Athens. Donald's the author of Stoicism and the Art of Happiness, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, Verissimus, the Stoic Philosophy of Marcus Aurelius, and How to Think Like Socrates. And in addition, he's the creator of numerous courses, as well as a gifted speaker. And in fact, he was the first person I interviewed for the Stoic Mom blog way back in 2017. And I have learned so much from him about resilience, anxiety, anger, all kinds of things, as well as Stoicism, of course, and its relationship to all of these emotions and the way we live, and history. Absolutely love his books. So I recently had the pleasure of seeing Donald in person in Athens. I joined him for a philosophy walk at the site of Plato's Academy, which was a lot of fun. And I got to meet a bunch of other practical philosophy and ancient philosophy folks there. And also we had a conversation at the National Archaeological Museum as well. And every time I talk with Donald or hear his interviews, I always learn something and a lot of things. So we're back together again here in this podcast. And I'd like to welcome you, Donald, for talking with me today.
Well, thank you very much. It's nice to see you again. And yeah, I'm looking forward to our chat.
Awesome. So wondered if we could start with, how did you first get interested in philosophy?
Well, it was a long time ago. So my father passed away when I was about 13 or 14 years old. And my father was a Freemason because Robert Burns, the National Bard of Scotland, was a Master Freemason. And all of my friends' fathers, I think, were Freemasons in the town where I come from. I was born in the town where Robert Burns was born. It's part of our heritage. Mm-hmm. And my father died. He didn't leave many things behind, but he left behind his books on Freemasonry. And I read them. And I couldn't make head nor tail of them. But they mentioned Pythagoras and Plato and stuff like that. And they mentioned the four cardinal virtues of Hellenistic philosophy or Greek philosophy, which correspond to the four corners of the Masonic Lodge, apparently. And somehow that inspired me to go and read other stuff about religion and kind of esoteric and occult stuff and historical stuff. And I guess I was looking for Freemasonry. To my father had been kind of like a philosophy of life, and I was looking for something to fill that gap and provide me with some guidance, I think. So I was going through quite a rocky time in my life. I got kicked out of school and put in a rehabilitation scheme for young offenders, and I didn't really have any qualifications or anything like that, so I didn't really know what I was going to do, and I didn't have a father, and I didn't have a lot of support. So I kind of thought, I need to figure out what on earth I'm going to do with the rest of my life, right, and starting from scratch, really. And I began looking for some sort of sense of direction, I think. And I read Plato, among other things. Weirdly, through reading kind of Christian Gnostic texts and things like that, it got me into reading Greek philosophy. Bit of trivia for you while we're at it. In the 1940s, one of the most important collections of early Christian texts was found at a place called Nag Hammadi in Egypt. And there was a big urn buried under a rock that contained a lot of books that a Christian Gnostic community had concealed. And in one of those books, there's a lot of pretty wild early Christian Gnostic, Hermetic stuff. It's like their own Bible before the Council of Nicaea created the Christian Bible. like early Christian stuff that is like a weird mixture of things that, like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Hebrews and stuff that we don't really, Christians don't really read much anymore. And in one of their codices, they have a load of early Christian Gospels, and then you turn the page, and there's a guy called Socrates, weirdly, to go banging on about like justice and stuff like that, because they have an excerpt from Plato's Republic featuring Socrates in dialogue in this Gnostic Christian gospel. Like, in a parallel universe, Meredith, Socrates is in the Bible. How weird is that?
That's
a
so
lot of people know
interesting.
that's fact, as the kids say. That's a fact.
Yeah,
Go look it up.
that's a fact.
Go look it up, kids. It's a real thing. Like, there were Christian communities out there who had Socrates in their Bible. Like, that's wild.
As well.
So, in Coptic, right? So I that made me think about, maybe I'll go and read more about this Socrates guy. And so I read Plato's Dialogues. I think by the time I was like about 17, I've tried a few times to figure. People ask me, and then I'm like, I don't know the dates. So a few times I've tried to kind of do some detective work and reconstruct the date. It was a long time ago, Meredith. I think when I was about 17, I was reading the Symposium and Plato's Apology and some of the more accessible Platonic texts. I had a book of excerpts from Plato's Dialogues that I found quite easy to read. I was lucky that I found that. And I remember reading that in the garden one summer in the sun and getting really into it. And then I went to university at Aberdeen and I did a degree in philosophy, and I studied Plato and Aristotle as part of my degree. Although I mainly kind of specialised in studying Wittgenstein and Heidegger at university. Then I did my master's at Sheffield in an interdisciplinary centre for philosophy, sociology, and psychotherapy. And I thought, when you say philosophy and you say psychotherapy, at least until very recently, and I think still to a large extent, philosophy departments think the only show in town is Freud and psychoanalysis and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Right. So particularly French, postmodern, kind of like, and Marxist theories and stuff like that, they're all about the Freud, right? Lacan, Derrida, like all these guys. So when we were the interdisciplinary centre, it was all about psychoanalytic thought and kind of existentialist and postmodern thinkers. And so I got, like many people, my friends who studied theology at university used to tell me that a lot of people who study theology by the end of doing the degree are atheists, right? They've kind of talked themselves out of it eventually. You go deep enough into the subject, sometimes you persuade yourself that you've had enough of it. And so I did enough of existentialism and psychoanalysis. I did my master's degree on Jean-Paul Sartre and existential phenomenology. And I thought, somehow, I feel like if I read enough Heidegger and Sartre, it would make me more neurotic, right, rather than less so, right? And so I thought, there's got to be a better way. And the stone that the builders discarded became the cornerstone. So I thought, one of the few, in all truth, the road that I followed that got back, and I'm sorry if there's a bit of a winding road, that might be kind of interesting story. I'd studied the Gnostics, and I got really into the Gnostics, and there's a guy called Pierre Hadot, and Hans Jonas I really liked as well. Pierre Hadot had written a book on Plotinus called The Simplicity of Vision, the Neoplatonists. And Gnosticism is steeped in Neoplatonism. It's a kind of spin-off of it in some ways. So I read his book on Plotinus, and I thought, this is so cool. I'm going to read all the other books by Pierre Hadot that I can get my hands on. And as I read his other books, I kind of thought, he talks about Stoicism a lot. Stoicism seems to be, out of all, so Hadot's thing is, all these Hellenistic philosophies talk about spiritual exercises. I thought, well, you say that, but you keep coming back to the Stoics. They seem to be the ones that have more to say and a wider range of things to say. And the other schools are kind of talking about it a bit, but the Stoics are really specialising in this stuff. And that was number one thing as I read Hadot. And the number two thing I thought as I read Hadot was, how come this guy never mentions psychotherapy? Like, what he's doing is cataloguing spiritual exercises. I find it odd that he calls them spiritual exercises and yet never also refers to them as psychological exercises, it seems surprising that he doesn't find any parallels with modern psychotherapy. Maybe because he's French and they're into psychoanalysis a bit more, and he's not as familiar with CBT. So I became interested in Stoicism when I was doing my master's. That would be 1999. And I think I was already kind of starting to look at it a little bit before that. Anyway, and I became interested in cognitive behavioral therapy.
Mm-hmm.
And I suddenly thought, oh my goodness, these books on cognitive behavioral therapy keep quoting this guy called Epictetus at me. And they keep saying this thing over and over about how it's not things that upset us, but our opinions about him. And I thought, this has actually already become a cliche in cognitive behavioral therapy. The reason being, Albert Ellis, who was the first modern cognitive therapist, in 1953-ish, I believe, Ellis followed a very similar path. He was a psychoanalytic therapist. He'd done psychoanalytic therapy for, I think, 8 years or something like that. And he got fed up with it because he didn't think it was working that well. And he thought it was nonsense scientifically. And so he got a bit frustrated with it. And he did something that I admire people for doing. And that was kind of how I was feeling. He basically kind of got rid of all these books on psychoanalysis, figuratively. And he thought, I'm going to go back to the drawing board and start again from scratch. And he thought, I remember reading the Stoics, Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, when I was a teenager. And so he constructed a whole new approach to psychotherapy, kind of from scratch, drawing on the things that he'd been reading, and particularly the Stoics. And so I thought, wow, this is awesome. People in the CBT field are really into Stoicism, and that makes perfect sense to me. So I thought, if I just keep reading books on CBT, I can't wait to see what other things from the Stoics they quote. And I picked up one book on CBT after another, and they all said it's not things that upset us, but rather our opinions about them. Ellis had taught that to all of his students. He quotes it in all of his many, many books. He taught it, I believe, to all of his clients in therapy, like thousands and thousands of clients. So the next generation of CBT therapists quoted this because they saw Ellis had said it. And do you know what else they said about Stoicism, Meredith? Nada.
Oh.
Nothing. Like, virtually nothing, right? So I'm reading and thinking, when are we going to get back to Stoicism? And I thought, this is so weird, because not only are they quoting it over and over again, but this is, in a sense, the fundamental premise of Stoic psychology, if you like. And this is really the cognitive model of emotion. It's the fundamental premise of CBT. And from this premise, in fact, you'd expect them to arrive at similar conclusions. They're starting from the same place. It's not a small thing. It's not kind of, by the way, they say something kind of similar. They say, no, the Stoics pinpointed the fundamental premise of our whole approach 2,000 years ago. So I was like, I can't wait until they start. There's a chapter on Stoicism in this CBT book. There wasn't. And I read and I read and I read and I read and read. Couldn't find anything. So I thought, okay, I'm going to do my PhD on Stoicism and CBT, and this is a piece of cake. It's a book that writes itself, because I'm just going to say Pierre Hadot catalogues all these psychological spiritual exercises, and we can find many parallels between these concepts and practices in modern CBT. And this seemed like a great idea at the time, Meredith. And then, so I went to my university and I said, I want to do my PhD in this. And they said, you what? And I said, well, I do it in Stoicism and CBT. And they were like, what? And they said, are you sure you don't want to do it in existentialism and psychoanalysis? And I was like, no, I want to do it in Stoicism and CBT. I'm fed up with existentialism and psychoanalysis. And they said, you'll have to go somewhere else, I'm afraid.
Wow.
Because we have zero interest in either Stoicism or CBT, frankly. Wow. And we could maybe scrape together somebody that knows about Aristotle that might help you with the Stoics, but I don't think there's anyone that gives two hoots here about this CBT malarkey. So, we can't supervise you. And I went around a bunch of different universities, and I couldn't find any university that supervise. So even though I graduated top of my year in university and I have a first in philosophy and I have a distinction in my master's degree, I couldn't get on a PhD program. So I gave up. And I'm kind of relentless, so I'd collected a lot of notes from my PhD thesis. So I'm sitting on this thinking, wow, that didn't work out, and this is I guess it's an interesting cognitive therapy teaching point, right? Because I had a strong desire to do this thing and it was thwarted. So I could have thought, this is a catastrophe. It's a disaster. It's worse. It's these two things. It's a disastrophe, right? It's worse than that. Like, this is awful.
Yeah.
Like, it's ruined everything. I could have thought, but I didn't really see it that way. I kind of saw it as a bit of an opportunity, and there was an opportunity to submit a book proposal to a psychoanalytic publishing house called Carnac in the UK, and I submitted a book called How to Think Like a Roman Emperor as a book proposal, and they rejected it, and submitted it several times. Cut long story short, because one of the acquiring editors said I would resubmit that if I was you, blah, blah. So I submitted it 3 times. I kept getting rejected. And so because at that time I was quite relentless, I called them up and I said, what sort of books do you want people to write? And they said, we'd like a book called The Philosophy of CBT. So I changed the title on my book proposal and sent the same thing back to them, and they sent me a contract for my first book.
Wow.
And they were like, we just don't like the title. And I was like, okay. So I wrote a book called The Philosophy of CBT that was based on all these notes that I'd been collecting from my PhD thesis. And then I got into writing books. And eventually I got an opportunity to pitch a book to a major publisher in the US. And it bothered me that I never got to use that title. So I submitted the same title, but a kind of different pitch. I think this time I'd written about 5 books or something, and they accepted it. And then How to Think Like a Roman Emperor went on to be translated into like 22 languages. I think
Amazing.
It's in now. It's sold like 300,000 copies or something like that.
Wow.
So just I'm just like, it's just kind of interesting looking back on it. But I think some people who want to be writers kind of like find that story kind of entertaining, because it was like, no, the one thing they didn't like was the title. Like, I just changed the title, resubmitted it, they approved it, and then I used the title for another book that ended up becoming a bestseller. Like, so I don't know what that tells you, but like, don't listen to other people's opinions.
Right. And be
Just
relentless to keep going with your ideas. Like, the relentlessness is important, because you never know who you're going to hit on what day with what idea that might actually have more value to them or meaning to them or something. But clearly that first publisher was a little misguided about your original idea, which has been an amazing book, and people have been all over the world reading that.
Yeah, I mean, it just wasn't in their kind of remit, like to publish that sort of book, but that worked out. And then I guess another part of this story that's relevant to your introduction is, gosh, I don't know, like 15 years ago or something like that. Like, I think after I'd written that book, maybe the first book, I got an email from a guy called Christopher Gill, who was Professor Emeritus of Ancient Thought at the University of Exeter. And he said, we want to run a workshop for academics. So basically, we just do like a brainstorming session. And I went to that, and I got the train down to Exeter. I was living in London. And I met Chris Gill and John Sellers and Tim LeBon and Jules Evans and a bunch of people there was a video somewhere on YouTube of us meeting in this room. And out of that, we decided to start Modern Stoicism, basically. And it gradually evolved into the organization that exists today. And at that time, Stoicism wasn't like really a thing. I mean, it was a niche. Like, when I started studying it, people said to me, why on earth would you want to waste your life studying this obscure academic niche subject that no one is interested in, right? Seriously. Like, wow. It didn't really exist. I think Modern Stoicism became popular when Irvine published his book. What's it called? Stoicism, something about joy, isn't it? I can't remember now. I always forget the title.
Yes. I
Is
know
it
what you're talking
Stoicism
about.
and the Art of Joy or something like that? I don't know. But that was, I think, the first bestseller on Modern Stoicism. And then hot on the heels of that, Ryan Holiday published The Obstacle is the Way and then the Daily Stoic and stuff like that. And by that
Right.
point, there was all this momentum.
Right.
And I think one of the things that drove this kind of renaissance of interest in Stoicism, partly with these books, another thing you can verify is data-based, is that when the movie Gladiator came out, and 25 years ago now, there was like a spike in people writing about and searching for information on Marcus Aurelius and the Meditations, right? So that accelerated the growth of interest in Stoicism. And it grew and it grew and it grew. I think that one of the big things ultimately that really drove it was the internet, because there was a kind of Stoic diaspora. Like, people read Seneca and Marcus Aurelius. Millions of people have copies of those books, right? But they didn't hang out. You know, you didn't get people going, "Hey, I'm into Marcus Aurelius. Are you into Marcus Aurelius too? We should hang out." Right? They just were dotted around the world, had no reason to rub shoulders or communicate with each other.
Right.
And then with the internet, suddenly people formed communities online. There could be a guy in China, like there could be a lady living in North London, and they could be arguing and insulting each other online about their opposing interpretations of Stoicism, for hours, like having endless fun. And so Stoicism coalesced online because these people had been bopping around but didn't know each other. And then suddenly they're all in contact, and people realized, oh, maybe Stoicism is actually much bigger and more popular than we kind of realized before. They just weren't talking to each other. And now they're talking to each other, forming communities. It's actually, I would say, become a legitimate genre of self-help or self-improvement nowadays. There's so many blogs and articles and books and podcasts. There are so many books that come out on Stoicism that at first I read them all. Like, I sat down. It would be like in the olden days when a man of letters could claim to have read every book on a subject, right?
Yes.
That people say that ended like at some point in the 19th century, and like I could claim to have read every available book on Stoicism, and then suddenly I'm like, wow, I can't keep up now with all of the books that are coming out. I haven't read most of them. There's a kind of flood of them.
Yeah.
So it grew and it grew and it grew and it grew and it grew. And now you have even Gwyneth Paltrow and people like that. Celebrities are into Stoicism. It's become and we have annual conferences. There are you can buy T-shirts, you can get Stoic merch.
Right.
People send me mugs.
Oh wow.
It's become a thing.
Yeah, it's sort of a movement. And a lot of people are interested in it who you might not expect. You just, encounter someone at a coffee shop and you're reading a book on Stoicism, and then, they 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 are too. But I do have a question about it, which is I'm curious what your thoughts are. What do you think that we as modern people tend to misunderstand about Stoic philosophy and other ancient philosophers?
That's a big question, and that could be a PhD thesis, right? So I'll pick a couple of things.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose the obvious answer, the boring answer maybe, is that people think being Stoic means being unemotional and having a stiff upper lip and stuff like that, and it doesn't mean that. And it's a particularly bad misconception because, from my point of view, there's a lot of research on what we call lowercase Stoicism from converging research groups all over the world that use tools like the Liverpool Stoicism scale that clearly show that lowercase Stoicism is bad for your mental health, basically. And the irony is that people associate it with toughness. So they think being lowercase stoic and kind of suppressing or concealing unpleasant or embarrassing emotions. It makes you tough, but the research actually shows that it makes you into a mental weakling. Like, it undermines emotional resilience and makes you much more fragile as a human being. So that the studies, longitudinal studies, show about people that exhibit that personality trait or coping style. Yet there's a wealth of research that shows that cognitive behavioral therapy is good for your mental health. And CBT is inspired by Stoicism. The founders of CBT, like Beck and Ellis, were explicitly inspired by Stoicism. So you wouldn't want to confuse something that's known to be bad for your mental health with something that's known to be good for your mental health, right? That would be a particularly unfortunate confusion to make. And yet the internet, so I think it's great that everybody talks about Stoicism, and I don't believe in kind of intellectual snobbery. Like, I think Stoicism is for everyone, like in the same way that Christianity is. You don't have to be a theologian. You don't have to be Thomas Aquinas to be a Christian, right? There are people that could barely read, perhaps, that might get bits of quotes from Marcus Aurelius and it might resonate with them. You know, you don't need to be a professor of philosophy to benefit from Stoicism. You don't need to completely understand Stoic physics or Stoic logic in order to benefit from it. The ancient Stoics would have felt that idea, that kind of intellectual snobbery, was anathema to everything that they believed in. Epictetus is not going to kick somebody out of his philosophy school, like, because they don't understand Chrysopian logic, right? He clearly, you know, he would have thought that's ridiculous, and you've got things back to front if that's how you view things. Nevertheless, it is true that in some ways Stoicism is a victim of its success, and all over the internet you'll find people confusing capitalist Stoicism with lowercase Stoicism. Like, so there's a lot of influencers that there are people out there who have never read any books on Stoicism. So despite what I just said, I think if you're teaching people about Stoicism and you're kind of creating content like podcasts and things like that, I think it does behove you to read at least one book on it. Right.
Makes sense. Yeah.
It sounds like I'm joking, and I'm not. Like, I'm deadly serious. I've met multiple people. I've met people who have written books on Stoicism who have never, I know, have never actually read any books on Stoicism. I have met podcasters. I've met people creating online courses in Stoicism that told me that they've never read any books on Stoicism and are not really interested in it. And you might think, how is that possible, Donald? And the explanation is because there are people out there who simply think market research tells me that people will buy this, and therefore I'm going to create it and sell it. But I'm not interested in the subject, and I've never read any books about it. Like, so, you know, literally, like, that's a reason why you'll find. And now you get a lot of AI generated bump that often completely misrepresent Stoicism. So I'm like, you don't, the fine details, like Epictetus would have said, look, you don't need to be an expert on everything Chrysippus said. Like, he scolds his students for that, but you have to understand the basic principles of the philosophy, right?
Yes.
Or we're going to end up in chaos. Like, you have to, you really get the kind of like the spirit of it at least. So I think that is a major source of confusion.
What do you recommend to? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I think the other thing that people don't get about ancient Stoicism is the virtue ethic, because in my experience of coaching and working with clients, I think all of them think they get that, and then once I actually start talking to them about applying it in their daily lives, they'll usually start to go, oh yeah, I think I'd missed the point of this originally. Because the Stoics said, Hierocles, that guy who we have fragments from round about the time of Marcus Aurelius, like, he's one of the Stoics that's less well known. He uses the word epistrophe to describe Stoicism, which is the Greek word for a religious conversion. And literally it means turning around, or you could say doing a U-turn, right? So his point is that, and this is a familiar point for the Stoics and the Cynics, that what they think they're describing is a radical upheaval in our fundamental moral worldview. They think, you guys have it back to front, like in Stoicism, Cynicism, and other philosophies are asking you to basically turn everything on its head in terms of your values and the way that you think about what's important in life. You guys think wealth and reputation are the be all and end all, and maybe you've got that completely back to front, and actually it's like wisdom and your character. But what are the implications of really absorbing that shift in perspective, that radical U-turn? I think most people today struggle to understand that. I believe that people in the ancient world generally have found the virtue ethic perspective more accessible to them intellectually, and that our culture has shifted so far away from it that it makes it, at least American culture and Canadian and British culture, so Western culture perhaps, has shifted so far away from ancient virtue ethics that it's hard for people to kind of grasp the concept. Whereas even non-philosophers, I think, in the ancient world would have been a little bit closer to that way of thinking.
That's really interesting. There's so many different threads here to unpack. I'd love a very, very a very short discussion about, you mentioned existentialism and all the studies that you did, and then kind of turning
discussion
away from
about existentialism is a contradiction.
Short contrast between existentialism and Stoicism, because I've also studied both, and I am curious about why you decided to turn away from the existentialist approach, and of course you mentioned Freud as well, but and then go towards a Stoic approach, and maybe tie that into your approach to psychology in general.
A short explanation of that would be okay. The really short and therefore somewhat facile explanation for that would be that the books were kind of boring to read.
Relatable.
I love Heidegger as much as the next guy, but he's quite hard going to read, and I didn't think it was kind of fun. And I didn't think it was helpful in the sense that some of those books, I was half joking earlier when I said it makes you more neurotic. I think it encourages ruminative thinking in a way that just doesn't really seem to be therapeutic.
Yes.
There's something actually about the nature of academic philosophy that generally encourages overthinking and ruminative thinking and what we call cognitive fusion. So you kind of have to be a little bit aware of that. So psychologists think more about their thinking, whereas philosophers are doing a lot of thinking and maybe not thinking as much about how their thinking is affecting their quality of life.
Right.
I think you can imagine if you get really deep into studying some of these obscure philosophies, you kind of lose perspective a little bit if you're not careful on life. And whereas I felt the Stoics and maybe ancient philosophers in general retained perspective on life despite doing philosophy. And this is my short explanation. One reason for that maybe would be that the ancient philosophers did something that modern philosophers don't do, which is that they engaged in philosophical dialogues and they wrote in the dialogue form. And modern philosophers generally think that's tedious, and they might have kind of debates and stuff, but they don't really practice the Socratic method in the same way or use it in their writing in the same way that they did in the ancient world. And I think the dialogue method in the ancient world retains more psychological self-awareness, is more therapeutic than the kind of lectures and essays that we tend to associate with philosophy today.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think, and sorry for the question being about a short explanation, because I do think that could be a whole series of podcasts that would be super interesting,
Yeah,
and a book. But I also had that experience. I kind of came up studying quite a lot of French literature and history. And I got into existentialists. I thought it was fascinating. But at some point, I started feeling it's also very depressing. And even though I kind of love some of, for example, Camus' formulation that you must imagine Sisyphus happy, it's, I think that is actually tied into some of my Stoic understanding as well. But I also think that, as you said, the ruminative and generally sort of dismal style of some of these
yeah,
thinkers, like Sartre, is really
yes,
rough going after a while. And then, I mean, I guess essentially at heart, I'm sort of an optimist. So I
yes,
like to think that there's something really good in human nature and that hell is not other people. So
yeah,
therefore, I go towards, Stoicism, and not just Stoicism, but as you said, all ancient philosophies where we're kind
yeah,
of trying to get the good out of people somehow. And that's something I
yes,
really think about a lot, that dig deep in there, and as you said, there's layers of our culture and our society that make that very hard and make that really radical to actually
yeah,
give up on a lot of these externals. But there's a way in which Stoicism gets to the heart of that. How do you
yeah.
really do that?
Well, Stoicism has this therapeutic bent. The general. I'm going to qualify this by saying that I know that if you say anything about existentialism, there's always going to be somebody that says, "But the such and such existentialist said the opposite of that," right?
Right, right.
Because it doesn't really form us. It's not a philosophy, right? It's really just a cluster of people that didn't like each other and disagreed with each other, and Sartre and Heidegger, like Heidegger. So I think Sartre thought he was doing something that resembled Heidegger, and Heidegger thought Sartre was doing something completely different that bore no resemblance to his philosophy.
Mm,
So there's a lot of that, right? So you have to be careful making generalizations about existentialism,
that's true.
unless you preface it by saying you don't care and I'm just going to make generalizations anyway, just for the fun of it. But generally, I think you're right. They come across as, and I know this will horrify people, they do often come across as more nihilistic or pessimistic compared to the Stoics, for example. And the Stoics say a lot of things that you can find parallels of in the existentialist authors. There's a surprising amount of similarity. However, the couple of things that are fundamentally different, briefly, is the emphasis that the Stoics place on the value of our character and virtue. So, most of the existentialists seem to struggle to find something to ground value in, which leaves people reading them feel a bit lost and nihilistic afterwards. Whereas the Stoics say,
Yes.
well, maybe your very character itself, is the source of value, and gaining insight into things and acting with integrity are good, and something. And for what it's worth, that way of thinking is shockingly similar to. I'll make a slight digression here. Cognitive therapy, I think many people realize, has many things in common with Stoicism. Cognitive therapy changed 20 odd years ago, and there was what we call a third wave of CBT, and there were many different approaches that, like, the next generation after Ellis and Aaron T. Beck approach things from a different perspective, and they never mentioned Stoicism really,
Mm,
the third wave. However, a lot of the things that they emphasized are even more like Stoicism than the stuff that Beck and Ellis, were saying. So one of the leading evidence-based treatments for clinical depression is a thing called behavioral activation, which is a form of behavior therapy. It makes no reference to Stoicism or ancient philosophies generally, but it's based on, it almost entirely consists of a way of thinking about our values that's clearly very, very, very similar to ancient virtue ethics, particularly Stoic virtue ethics, right? I mean, that in a way, that is a bigger parallel even than cognitive therapy, but it's approaching it from a very different perspective. So now I can't remember what we were saying before I made that digression. But
Well, you talked about the character.
oh, the existentialism, and so existentialism, I feel is something lacking in terms of the positive values, and not only is that intuitively something that appeals to people, it's not as less nihilistic, but it's very consistent with modern research and psychotherapy. Right, existentialism would, if you compared it to what we know about treating depression, you'd look at it and think existentialism maybe looks like it's got some similar ideas, but it could also make you much more depressed. Like, if you're not careful, whereas Stoicism would fit this much better and be far more consistent with what we know is psychologically healthy. So I didn't like that aspect of existentialism, I guess, the kind of slightly now. The other thing that's missing from it, and again, there may be some smart Alex out there that will say, well, that's not true, because Robert Solomon, for example, right? But generally speaking, existentialists don't emphasize the role of cognition and emotion as much. And I think that's a major oversight, because there's few things where I'd kind of put my foot down and say, we're right about that. But the existentialists made a big mistake there, I think, because they were definitely wrong. And cognition clearly plays a much bigger role, like all psychologists would now agree, in shaping emotion than people had previously assumed. And oh my goodness, who said that first? The Stoics had a whole cognitive model of emotion, where they wrote whole books about it and stuff 2,000 years ago. And they were right. They were definitely right about that. We know that they were right.
Could you give a real world example of what you mean when you talk about the cognition to emotion sort of pathway?
So usually if you have a client in therapy, they'll come in and they'll tell you how depressed they are, or angry, or anxious, or usually all of the above, right? And then they'll sit and they'll do what we normally think of as an assessment, right? But you could also view it as like a bit like somebody complaining for an hour. Like, so the client will sit in therapy and they'll talk about how awful their depression is, how it's ruining their life, how it's making them physically ill, it's disrupting their sleep, and it's affecting their performance at work. It really, really, really sucks that I'm this depressed or angry or anxious, they'll say, and they'll go into a lot of detail about how awful it is, right? So the reason I glibly say it's like someone complaining is that in the process of doing that, what they're actually doing without realizing it is heightening their motivation to change. So they go, this is awful, this is awful, and this is awful, and this is awful. So you think, well, you're going to really want to change this, right? You've given me a big list of motives for change. But then they will usually say, I can't help it. It's just the way I feel. So that's what we sometimes describe as an expression of stuckness. That's why I'm here. Like, I'm stuck. Like, I really, 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 really want to change this. It really sucks. I can't, because it's just how I feel. And then Ellis, the first cognitive therapist in modern times, used to lean forward and smile at the client and say, yeah, but it's not just how you feel, is it? It's also how you think, right? Because these feelings don't come out of nowhere. When somebody is angry, they typically believe that somebody else, if I was angry with you, Meredith, there's some variation in forms of anger, but typically, I'd be angry with Meredith because I think that you've done something that you shouldn't have done, right?
Right.
And also the thing that you've done is really bad, right? And not only that, Meredith, it makes you a bad person, right? And not only does it make you a bad person, but I'm starting to think that you deserve to be punished. Like, we should at the very least give you a severe ticking off. Like, I should give you a piece of my mind, Meredith, because you're a jerk, because you did this thing that you shouldn't have done, like, and it was really bad, right? So that's the cognitive architecture of anger, right? That's all stuff I believe. And you might be sitting there, Meredith, you might think, but none of those things are true, Donald, right? It's possible that all of those things might be mistaken. Some or all of the above might be wrong. Right. It might be, number one, you might not even have done the thing. right? I mean, sorry about that, Meredith. Somebody told me you did this awful thing. Turns out they were lying, right? Or I got the wrong end of the stick. I might be just wrong about that. Number one, right? I might be being unreasonable about thinking that you shouldn't have done it and it's really unfair, because maybe I did the same thing myself yesterday. So
Right.
maybe I'm a big old hypocrite, like, for assigning value to it in that way, and I'm contradicting myself, right? So you might go, that's not even rational or coherent of me, right? And maybe I'm saying what you did was really awful. Maybe I'm now just being a drama queen and exaggerating how bad it is. What did she do? She disagreed with something you said in a book. Like, yeah, but
Right.
that's awful. Well, it's not that bad. Like, you're kind of blowing it out of proportion. So I might be
Right.
exaggerating how bad it is. And also, I'm vilifying you. I'm like, that makes you a horrible person and a complete jerk.
Right.
Right? So I'm
Right.
defining your entire. I'm objectifying you, as existentialists would say, reifying you and defining your entire personality in terms of one trait. When in fact, you're a complex, fallible human being with many different traits, capable, doing lots of different things. But so adopting a very reductionist and objectifying kind of attitude towards you in my anger. So I might be wrong factually about some of these things, and other things might be kind of contradictory of me, or sort of logically incoherent of me, or kind of reductionist of me, right? So once you recognize the cognitive basis of emotion, then you open up a whole toy box, a whole toolbox, a whole armamentarium of cognitive therapy techniques. So we could use Socratic questioning, we could use perspective shifting techniques. There's lots of different techniques we could now use to go, Donald, have you thought this through? The things you're saying maybe don't even make sense. And if I went, okay, you know what? First of all, like, I don't even know if Meredith did this thing. Even if she did, like, maybe it's not unfair of her. She's got a right to do it. Maybe it wasn't as bad as I've made out. Like, even if she did do it, maybe even if I don't like the thing she did, like, she's kind of a nice person. She helped an old lady across the street earlier. Like, she's not. There's no reason to vilify. Then I'm probably. Point being, right, if you can imagine that actually I changed all of those cognitions, am I still going to be angry? Am I still going to be as angry? Like, at the very least, I'm not going to have the same emotion. Like, there's no way that you can change the recipe, like, and end up baking the same cake. Right? Because,
Right.
like, if I choose those cognitions, even if I'm still a bit annoyed with you, I'm not going to have the same intensity or quality of anger that I had before. It's definitely going to change my emotions. Emotions, kids, are definitely cognitive, right? There's no two ways about it, right? It's more complicated. They're not entirely reducible to cognition, but there's definitely a cognitive element, as the Stoics realized 2,000 years ago. And yet, generally speaking, even if some of the existentialists realize that, they don't tend to give it enough emphasis, and they certainly don't usually think through the practical implications of it, the therapeutic implications of it sufficiently.
This is a really good example, and I think it's happened to all of us. So I have a question about your own life and practices. How do you use Stoic concepts in your own everyday life, and are there some that kind of have stood out to you as really helpful?
Well, it's kind of hard to answer because, in all honesty, because I write books about Stoicism and because I work with clients and I give talks, I spend all blinking day, every day, talking to people like your good self, or so people go, I mean, when does Stoicism kind of feature in your life much? Like, it's kind of taken over a bit, like,
Yeah,
since I was
it is your life
like,
now. Yeah.
yeah. And so how often do you think about Stoic? Like, all day, every day, pretty much.
Right.
And to make it worse, my wife is a lovely woman, like, writes books about Stoicism.
Right.
Um, so, and occasionally my kids eat like, even my daughter, like, sometimes brings stuff up. So I'm like, oh my god, I can't get away from this thing. So since I left university, which was like a really long time ago now, it's pretty much all day, every day. And so you say, well, do you actually kind of use the concepts? Well, like, yeah, I mean, I'm constantly like thinking about the concepts and the practices. Yeah, constantly. I use the practices constantly with clients and coaching and stuff. And so when someone asks me a question, I say the answer to that would fill an entire book, like lots. But what I'll do is like pick one or two examples out of all of that. So for the first, I often find when you get really deep into a subject, the answers that you give people at first seem kind of unsatisfying the further you get into a subject. So if you spoke to somebody who was a 10th Dan black belt in karate, and you said, could you teach me something really cool about how do you become really good at karate? Like, rather than going, I'll show you some really complicated spinning, flying, back kick thing, they're probably going to go, it's all got to do with the way that you stand, or something like really. It seems so simple. They'll say things like, it's how you breathe. You're like, what? Like, it's kind of disappointing at first. You think, how is that?
Right.
The deeper you get into a subject, it's usually the basics that start to seem more important, right? So there are many Stoic techniques that I've written about in my books, but I think that it's the virtue ethic, which I mentioned earlier, that really is the key thread that unites absolutely everything, and kind of adopting that perspective and encouraging other people to make this kind of shift, like this U-turn to a different perspective, is key. This is kind of known to be key now in modern research and psychotherapy as well. Like, it's a big deal, not just I mentioned depression earlier, but in the treatment of mental health problems in general, certainly emotional disorders in general. So that is a thing. How does that manifest? I mean, I'll give you a really silly example.
Sure.
I went into my local in Montreal. I went into the local witchcraft shop. Right, we have a witchcraft shop, and it's run by some very nice people. Witches, like, we believe that one of my ancestors was a famous witch, by the way. But it didn't end that well for her. Like, in Scotland, stories about witches don't tend to turn out. There's a lot of burning people at the stake and things.
It
went down. They didn't come out of it that well, right? But nowadays, they're all on Instagram, right? So it's a whole witch culture has changed, right? For the better, I think. So anyway, I went to the local witch shop and I said, could you give me a magic stone? I'm in the market for a magic stone that has to do with anger, right? Because I'm writing a book about anger at the moment. It's my favourite thing. I love anger, right? So they bought me a magic stone. They sold me a magic stone. Like, you might think, well, that shows what an idiot you are, right? But I paid like $20 or something for a magic stone.
Okay. And
I carry it around with me everywhere, right? Not because I believe in the magical properties of stones, but because now, forever, it's ingrained in my memory that I went into a witchcraft shop and asked for a magic stone that has to do with anger. And now whenever I pull this thing out of my pocket, I think, oh yeah, this is this thing that I bought. I spent $20 on it, like, because they told me that it has symbolic connections with anger. And so whenever I pull it out, I use it as a cue that reminds me of the value that I place on overcoming anger. And the virtues, like magnanimity and kindness and empathy, that I see as being particularly relevant to that goal in life. And so every day when I go to work, I have it in my pocket constantly. I better have it now. I've been a little bit liar.
I'd love to see it.
Right. You see it? That's it there. There you go.
Oh, nice. Right. Carnelian?
A magic stone.
Yeah.
I think it's red jasper, if I remember rightly.
It's really pretty,
right?
yeah.
And every day I take it out and I put it on my desk when I'm working. And then I pick it back up again and put it in my pocket when I go somewhere. And I'm walking along the street, I take it out and I treat it like a fidget toy, you know, and I toss it around in my hand while I'm walking down the street and going home at night and stuff, you know. Not as a form of self-defense, like if I get attacked by a mugger, I'll put a stone up. But,
toss your anger stone at someone.
Yeah, how'd you like that? You know, but because it reminds me of the thing that is most important to me in life, which is like the problem of anger and how to deal with it. So it gives me a sense of kind of focus on my priorities. It would be a bit like a Christian carrying around a crucifix in a
Mm-hmm.
way. It just happens to symbolize, what I consider to be the most important thing in life to me. And, that's so in practice, that is how I retain contact psychologically with the virtues. This is a good example. So we know one of the things I think people miss from studying philosophy, you could be reading a lot about ethics and stuff, but someone can have like a clear idea of what their values are, but lose contact with them psychologically, right? That's very
Okay.
clear when you start working with people, doing coaching or therapy.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so that's why it can't just be a intellectual exercise, right?
So they sort of
So
forget what their values are. They forget
yes,
what they care about at deep
yeah,
down and
yeah,
what's really meaningful to them. And then, so for
yeah,
example, having the stone is something that helps you remind yourself. It's more of a
yeah.
reminder. Yeah. Okay.
And you might even be living virtuously. You might even be dedicating your whole life, like a philosopher might say, I really value wisdom, and all I do all day is attend seminars and read books and dedicate my life to it, but somehow it's still not really fulfilling. And it's not fulfilling because they've disconnected their
Mm,
actions from their values. For one of it, they've decoupled them, right? So they're
mm,
actually doing stuff that's consistent with their values, but
mm-hmm.
they don't get any psychological fulfillment from it because they
Ah,
don't experience the connection between the action. Even though there is one theoretically, they've
yeah.
lost sight of it, right? They've forgotten why they're doing this stuff.
Right, right.
And so for some people, like getting overcoming depression and getting connected with your values might be about changing your routine, changing your career, changing things so that you're actually doing stuff that's more consistent with
Mm-hmm.
your values. But for other people, it might actually, believe it or not, just consist in realizing why you're doing the stuff, that, remembering why am I here in this philosophy department, for example? Why am I
Mm-hmm.
sitting here talking to these clients? Oh yeah,
Right.
because like I really value, not just to make money. Society brainwashes us into thinking you're doing everything to make money,
Mm,
right? Or status. And so it's really easy to lose sight of that. If you're depressed, but you're kind of like trying, I mean, the world is full of people that are trying to do the right thing, but still feel
mm-hmm.
kind of depressed and unhappy and unfulfilled, right? And it's often like books of philosophy don't really make this clear, like, but it's more obvious in psychotherapy. You've lost sight of the connection between your values, like the Stoic virtues,
Yes.
character-based values. I'm specifically talking about here,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
and your own actions. So you need
Mm,
to find ways, and then you could view that as kind of something that's quite closely related to mindfulness practice, or
mm-hmm.
certainly in modern behavioral therapy, it's viewed as something that integrates with and highly complements training in mindfulness practice. So being continually aware of what your character-based values are and how they relate to the way that you're living your life is kind of the key to being fulfilled. And forgetting about that and losing sight of it is going to make you depressed, right, and
So
unfulfilled.
interesting, Donald. This is fascinating to me. And I have done work in coaching, and there's also that idea about, getting at the client's values and also that kind of framing around, in a way, almost elevating the values to something important, not just something that's just fleeting here and there, but something that is really central to how we live our
Yeah.
lives and maintaining that awareness of it, which, as you said, a lot of things we do day in, day
Well,
out, separate us from that awareness.
I'll go further, Meredith. Like, most of my clients are successful guys.
Mm,
Like, they're all men for some weird reason. Like, occasionally I have a female client, but
hmm
that's pretty unusual in the therapy world. Like, I don't entirely know why it is, but like for all of my clients are men. It didn't used to be like that when I worked in
Interesting.
Harley Street in London, but
hmm
now it is all men. And a lot of them are successful guys. Some of them are very entrepreneurs, CEOs, senior guys, like successful at what they do. Virtually every one of them. As soon as I mentioned doing values work in therapy, they're like, I've done all that in corporate training. Like, I've got a list somewhere.
Oh.
I've got it written down somewhere what all my
Right.
values are, right? And yet, they maybe have spent a lot of time and they've got a fairly good idea about what their values are. Often there's like a bit more work that they could do refining it, but usually it's kind of like 80% there-ish, like, or whatever. But so there's two parts to it. One is clarifying your values, and then the other part is actually living in accord with them and experiencing the psychological connection. So often they're like, maybe they're 80, 90%, maybe even 100% of the way they are in terms of clarifying the values, because they've done loads of corporate workshops and coaching and stuff like that. But usually the other part, they've done like zero. Like, weirdly, there's a massive disparity. So it's entirely a pen and paper exercise for them in most cases, in all cases that I've ever seen of it. Like, and virtually all of them are like, yeah, I've never really thought about how I should be living my life differently for some weird reason, and they've never really thought about, in any depth about how to connect psychologically their awareness of their values with the tasks that they're engaged in. So you would be, you might be writing a book, right? And you think, the reason that I got into this in the first place is because I love the idea of being the sort of person that writes books and kind of really tackles interesting subjects creatively and with integrity and stuff like that. That's the kind of guy that I want to be. Well, society will knock that out of you pretty sharp, right? And after a while, you'll be thinking, I'm doing this to make money or get the good reviews and things like that. Society will knock it out of you every time, unless you're careful. And you drag yourself, you protect yourself and against the prevailing values of our society.
Yeah,
right?
How do you get it back? I mean, how do you do this?
You have to get back. Like, well, first of all, you've got to realize, like the answer to all such questions begins with the same answer, which is the first thing is you have to realize what the problem is. Right? You've got to notice that you're doing it. Right? How do I stop biting my fingernails? You've got to notice, first of all, that you're actually biting your fingernails and spot when it's happening. Right? So first thing is you've got to realize that when you're working on your book, you've shifted your values now, and it's kind of become a means to an end, like rather than something that's intrinsically valuable to you. And you have to start thinking about the connection between you. First, you've got to get clear about what your values are in relation to writing or cleaning toilets or whatever it is you do for a living, right? And you've got to consider, how does this actually relate to the type of person that I want to be in life? And you have to keep reminding yourself of that and make an effort. Then you have to think, how would I approach this differently if I was acting consistently in accord with my core values? Right? Would I be thinking about my writing differently? Like, would I be writing slightly different stuff? Would my internal dialogue about it take a slightly different form? You've got to keep training yourself to come back to approaching it from the right perspective in order to reconnect with the values. Otherwise, the cardinal virtues of Stoicism, and other core values mean nothing to you. It's just words, right? And that's what it is. I put that emphatically because my clients will tell you, that's where most people are at. Right? I read all these books of Stoicism, and I like the idea of these cardinal virtues. And like Epictetus would probably say to you, but you're not actually doing anything about it, buddy. You read about it. And this brings me back to another problem, which I think Buddhists are aware of and address, but the Stoics also were, which is a lot of my clients, all human beings, but I'm very aware of this in my clients, that they often do a lot of mindfulness and meditation and journaling and blah, 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 right? They do self-help, right? Now, I think there are many problems with the whole concept of self-help, right? I could run through a short list of, but basically I think there are intrinsically things wrong with self-help. How can that be, Donald? Surely self-help's a fantastic thing, right? Kids today drink from a veritable fire hose of self-help.
That's true.
I don't know. I can remember when I was a kid, we had stuff like that, but it was, it was like a special treat at the weekends. You get a little bit of self-help from reading a book or something like that, you weren't consuming it all day long on the internet, right? They're consuming supposedly self-help. Well, then you would think we'd be living in a utopia, a golden age.
Yeah.
Like all these guys in particular on the manosphere that are consuming self-help advice from Jordan Peterson and Andrew Tate and all these dudes would be fully functioning, like highly evolved individuals, and society would be living in a golden age from all the self-help that we're consuming.
That's right.
And yet, I'll stick my neck out here and say that I don't think that's the case. Like, I feel that the benefits of self-help have been negligible, or, overall impact on society. It's hard to spot, given that the prevalence of mental health problems is increasing rather than going down. So something's not right here. I think there are several subtle problems with the nature of much of modern self-help and the way that people consume it. So one of them is, and this is such a simplistic thing, right? But for many people, self-help is something that's compartmentalized in their life. So I'll give you an example. I knew a guy years and years ago. I had a client who did a lot of yoga, and had for all his life, maybe. Like, he was really good at it. And he ran a business where one of his employees used to kind of really get on his nerves. And he had a problem losing his temper with this guy, right? And get really angry. And yet he could do savasana or yoga nidra and relax. Like, his heart rate would lower, like, on his yoga mat. And yet his blood pressure would go through the roof as soon as he set foot into the workplace, right? So I think that's a really simple example of how his coping skill and ability to relax and control his heart rate was highly compartmentalized. He left on the yoga mat, and he hadn't transferred that skill to the very situation where it would be most useful to him. Relaxing on the yoga mat is of negligible benefit in the grand scheme of things. It's kind of fun and games. Maybe it generally has some health benefits. It'd be a lot more useful to you if you managed to do that when somebody was annoying you. Like, it'd be more functionally useful in that situation, right? And that's everybody. Everybody, when they do self-help, they'll do their mindfulness meditation for 10 minutes every morning, and then they'll forget about it for the rest of the day.
Yeah.
Right? And just revert back. They'll do their journaling, and they'll be like Socrates sitting there when they're doing their journal, like being wise and self-aware and enlightened for like 10 minutes. And then for the rest of the day, they'll revert back to what Ellis used to call the crazy BS that, is going on between their ears for the rest of the day. Right? So I hate to break it to you, but like, journaling for 10 minutes is of negligible benefit if you then just spend the other 99% of the day indoctrinating yourself into crazy BS. Like, in the same way that if you spoke nicely and empathically to your kids for 10 minutes every day, and then spent the rest of the day yelling at them and insulting and demeaning them, like, how would that work out? Like, people might say, well, that's a form of kind of psychological tokenism, right? You go, but I was being a very empathic and caring parent for like 5. I do my parental empathy and supporting them for like 5 minutes every morning, and then you'd be like, but you're a total jerk to them the rest of the time. So, I mean, it's not rocket science,
Yeah, that's a good analogy. Yeah, exactly.
Silly, right? It's kind of silly, right? It doesn't make sense. You're kidding yourself, buddy. But that's what people do to themselves every day, right? And then they come into therapy and they'll say, well, I do my meditation and do my journaling, but so I can't understand why I'm still so neurotic, right? And you're like, because you spend the other, like, 16 hours every day indoctrinating yourself into crazy BS, like, and undoing all of the good work that you did. What difference does it make? So it's true that you might get some lasting benefit, right? I don't want to trivialize it too much, but think about the weight. Like, think about how much you could be undoing that. So what's the solution to that, Meredith? right? Well, you can't journal all day every day,
Right.
right? But it has to be. It has to be. And again, I'm a broad-minded kind of guy. Like, I don't like to make generalizations. But I said earlier, look, it has to be that cognition is part of emotion. It's a fact. We know this for sure. It's beyond dispute. You kind of have to be crazy to not believe that now. Like, so we should be past that, right? Like, it's obvious. It's got to be some kind of mindfulness practice. There has to be some kind of. The Epictetus and Musonius Rufus say you have to practice prosoche. Like, you have to pay attention, because if you don't pay attention to what you're doing, you'll just revert back to your old habits. And then it can take you ages to regain attention. And by that time, you've already lost your temper and shouted at your kids and messed up everything. Like, just because you're a saint for 5 minutes every morning, like, that doesn't mean anything. Like, you have to at least, and you don't have to be a saint 24/7, but you have to at least notice when you're acting like a jerk. Right?
The awareness.
It would be like saying, for 5 minutes every morning, I practice self-awareness and I stop biting my fingernails. And then the rest of the day, I don't pay much attention, so I'm probably biting my fingernails all the time. I wouldn't even know, couldn't even tell you, probably. Right? Well, but you'd have to pay attention, right? Yeah. I'm sorry. Yeah. Like, there's no conceivable way that you can practice get around the obvious problem that you're just going to undo everything you do, unless you're going to have to pay attention to your own actions and stream of consciousness more or less continuously, or as frequently as you can throughout the day, like the Buddhists do and like the Stoics recommend. That's actually lacking in cognitive therapy to some. I mean, there is mindfulness in cognitive therapy, but traditionally, cognitive therapists fell into this trap, of saying, "I do your homework and then do your self-monitoring and all that." What are they doing the rest of the time, though? Like, the opposite, right? So what sense is there in suggesting that you do your homework for 5 hours? You might get some knock-on benefit from that. Like, it does generalize, right? But if you're just going to revert back and do the contrary, and undo all of that stuff, clearly, common sense should tell us. There's a lot of things that we do in therapy, I have to say, and I love the therapy field and I defend it to the hilt and stuff, but there are quite a lot of things that we do to this day in the therapy field that seem to me to be contrary to common sense. Right? And one of them is the way we compartmentalize techniques, and that we don't really think of it in terms of 24/7 process people are engaged in. And yet I think it's become more obvious now. We live in this self-help addicted culture. Yeah. That all of the clients are I've read every book by Jordan Peterson. I've done all of the workshops, courses. I've read all these books on Stoicism and stuff like that. Right? That's every client now, right? I've got a bookshelf full of self. It used to be I'd read all the books that they'd read, and now I'm like, my clients have you read this? Have you read that? And I'm like, whoa, no, I'm really, I can't keep up now with all the self-help stuff, right? I do my best. I used to be on top of it, not anymore. So much of it.
There's so much.
And yet, they're no better off, than they were.
Yeah. But I was going to say, Donald, it's a lot of work. I mean, it's a lot of cognitive work to have that awareness. And I don't think that people value it. I don't think people are taught to value it or told to value it, because, as you said, everything is time is money or something. Kind of the society we live in is focused on certain types of productive work. Oh yeah, I produced this report, therefore it's valuable. What about what's going on, as you said, between your ears?
Yeah, between your ears,
right? And that's
where all the action is.
That should have value, but we don't really we don't think of it that way, and therefore we don't focus on it or kind of give it the kind of importance that it should have in order to actually live better. That's my opinion on it, at least.
Because we're all brainwashed from birth to be enslaved by a superficial consumerist culture. Yeah. And then do you know what happens at the end of it? You die, right? And then you're lying on your deathbed, right, looking back on it, and you think, God damn it, I wish I could have made more money. Like, if only I could have got more followers on Twitter. Like, I wish if I could get a redo
right.
as you gasp your final breath.
Yeah.
You're like clutching the sheets alone in the dark. Like, you're thinking, man, if I was given another chance, I'd go back and I'd be all about that Instagram, right? And
Donald,
nobody thinks
on this note. I can end on this note. So I have one more question for you that's related to what we were talking about. What do you think is the relationship between that a person's values and the Stoic virtues, or the virtues that we find in ancient philosophy? Because people have asked me that question. What's that relationship? Are my should my values be based in the virtues? Are the virtues, yeah. So I'd love to just hear you think about, a person's values and the virtues.
Well, the terminology we have to use in modern psychology is I think everyone knows it's clunky and kind of confusing and annoying. And that tells us something about how messed up our culture is. Like, because we don't even have adequate terminology to articulate basic psychological distinctions that actually were taken for granted by people in the ancient world. We have a grossly inadequate vocabulary for emotion, and we have a kind of grossly inadequate vocabulary for talking about values. We find that when we're trying to explain this to clients. So we have to use jargon, which is always a warning sign that, if we don't even have a word for this, we've got to make up stupid sounding words. Like, that's a bad sign for society. So first thing is, there's a fundamental distinction between the type of value that you place on external outcomes, like stuff that you want to happen in the future, and the type of value that you would place on the way that you go about doing stuff, or your character traits, or your personality. So those are like the virtues, right? For example, there's a difference between wanting to write a best-selling book, which we could call, some psychologists call, extrinsic value, like, or external goals or whatever. And so there's a difference between wanting to write a best-selling book and wanting to be an author who has creativity and integrity, which is they call an intrinsic value, or a character trait, or a character strength, or like a virtue in Stoicism. This distinction is just fundamental to ancient. It just is ancient virtue ethics, basically. It's integral to it, right? And so sometimes I'll have clients and they'll say, well, I've clarified my values, and my values are I want to be famous or whatever. And I'm like, but that's not really what we mean by values in modern therapy. Like, in modern therapy, when we talk about values, we're talking about these character-based values. You can think of them as being more like verbs. It's the way that you do stuff. You do it with integrity. Like, you do it with discipline. You do it with endurance. Like, you do it with magnanimity. You do it with generosity. Like, or also sometimes it can be defined as the way that you fulfill a role. So I'm a good parent. Like, I'm a good colleague, I'm a good friend. And you can say, what are the traits of a good friend? You can break it down a little bit more.
Yeah.
Like honesty, integrity, compassion, empathy, stuff like that, right? There's a big difference psychologically and morally between these two characteristics. So many people's values are actually just external goals that they want to achieve. And they've lost sight. They're looking, all of those values are located in the future, right? Let me put it this way. It's like you're thinking to yourself, I will be happy when I publish a best-selling book, or when I make $1 million, or when I do this, or when I pass my degree, or something like that. That's what I want. That's the most important thing in life to me. And when I get that, I'm going to be happy. And that basically sends a message to your brain that says you should be unhappy until you get it. Right?
Yes.
Duh. Like, so you've created this like algorithm that actively makes you miserable, like, until you get this thing, and then you get it. Now, you might not get it. Maybe you'll never get it. You might get hit by a bus, right? So suppose there's two people. There's one author that's like, I just want to be an author, and I want to do it. I want to be the sort of author that I admire, someone with creativity and integrity. Now, you could do that every day of your life. You could, even if it was for 5 minutes, you might go, I'm just going to try really hard to write something with a bit of creative, or I'm going to, even if you could be looking at a blank page and think, at least I tried, right? I looked at it, but I didn't come up with a word, writer's block, but I did it. I went there and I sat and I tried to do it, and I'm committed to do it. The paradox is, even the commitment to exhibit the virtue is potentially something that people find activates the virtue and is fulfilling, right? So I failed to exhibit creativity, but but at least I was completely committed. At least my heart was in it. I was trying. You'll get fulfillment from that. When do you get the fulfillment? You go, well, I did the thing, but I might have to like wait a few days before the sense of fulfillment kicks in. Usually it happens immediately, right? You go like, I'm there, I'm doing the thing. I'm doing the thing, Meredith. Like, that I said was the most important thing in life to me, right? So you've got two writers. You've got one writer that's like that. He's got a values orientation, right? A character-based orientation. Yes. He's like, do it every day of my life. I'm doing the thing that makes life worth living for me, right? And then you've got another guy who's like, I want to be a writer because I want to write a best-selling book, right? Or I want to get some kind of acclaim, and I'm going to get that. It's going to take me a few years. Could take me 10 years to get this book out, right? You know, I'm writing around. I'm going to get it one day. And they're both, lives are identical, and they get to the day before they're about to, you know, hit the bestseller charts and the New York Times bestseller list or something. And both of these guys, in a double tragedy, like, they're both hit by a bus on the same day, right? And in the afterlife, they're looking down in this hypothetical, non-existent afterlife.
Right.
And the guy who's like, the most important thing to me was to get that goddamn book published, like, hit the bus just a day before it happened. By definition, from that perspective, I guess he would look at his entire life and think it was a total waste of time. And everything he did was worthless, because all of the value consisted in getting the thing at the end of it, and he got hit by a bus the day before. So his entire life was essentially completely worthless, right? Because the other dude might think, you know, I never got the book published, but the most important thing to me wasn't getting the book published. The most important thing to me was the way that I went about doing that, and I did that every single day of my life. I approached it with integrity and creativity. So my whole life, like, was filled with value, like, and worthwhile, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of a big deal, right?
Yeah.
It's a big difference, right? Depending on how you connect with your values and how you define them. How does it relate to Stoic values, right? Research on values, contrary to nihilism and moral relativism, the weird thing is, when psychologists survey people about their values cross-culturally, there's a surprising amount of consensus, right? In abstract terms. So people disagree about whether you should eat pork or not, right? Or or have sex with your siblings, or eat the parts of your deceased, like, relatives as a funeral ceremony, you know, in anthropology, right? There's a lot of things people disagree about between cultures, but pretty much all cultures throughout history and in the world today agree, like, wisdom's a good thing, honesty's, like, fundamentally a good thing, like, you know, things like courage, like, good. Like, I don't think there's a culture in the world that thinks courage is a bad thing, right? So there's broad consensus about the abstract virtues across cultures, right? It's easy. So you go, what are my values? You know, I'd be surprised, like, if at some level you didn't value the same things as everyone else, right? And so people tend to emphasize certain values, or they define them differently, or they use different language to articulate them. The big difference is how they apply them, right? So I think, like, maybe all Americans believe that society should be fair, right? Fundamentally, they agree on that. Not many. I don't think there's many people in America that would say deep down, fundamentally, I think society should be unfair. Like that seems like a good. It should be unjust would be better, right? You'd have to be pretty contrarian, right? You could say it, but I don't know how many people really believe that. But man, they fight like cat and dog about what justice looks like in practice, or what fairness looks like in practice. Epictetus says exactly the same thing. We have the same preconceptions about values, but we disagree about how they should be applied in practice, right? So clarifying your values, you shouldn't just accept the values because the Stoics say so. It's risky to do that. But the paradox is that if you search deeply within yourself, you're going to probably find out, you go, what pops out at the end of it, you go, and at the end of all your values qualification and journaling, you'll go, nah, they're not just valuing the same things as the Stoics. Probably, pretty much. Why was that? Because they're framing it in such abstract terms. Right. That there's a broad consensus. So research on character strengths and values tends to arrive at pretty similar conclusions. The cardinal virtues of Stoicism feature prominently in research on values that's conducted today, basically.
And those virtues are wisdom, courage, temperance, and justice. Yes? Or how do you define those? Am I getting it right?
That's what they are.
Yeah.
But that's not really what they are. Right? Because the translation is quite bad. Right? So for sure, like wisdom, for the Stoics, like what we call justice is the worst one, right? The worst translation. So it's dikaiosune, right? So it kind of is that it means, it refers to justice, but really in a broader sense. And the Stoics explicitly state that it includes kindness. Now, what we mean by justice today usually would exclude kindness, like it's meant to be completely impartial, right? The Stoics say there are two main elements of dikaiosune. One is fairness, and the other is kindness, or compassion, we would say, towards other people. That's lost in translation. Yes. You might think, are you sure about this, Donald? The Stoics well, if you pick up Marcus Aurelius and reread it, I think you'll find that on virtually every page of the Meditations, he emphasizes pro-social virtues. Yes. Like oikiosis, like kinship, kindness towards other people, cosmopolitanism. And when he's not doing that, he's disputing alienation and anger, which are the vices that are contrary to the virtue of kindness, right? Throughout the entire book, right? It's pretty clear, but that's lost in translation.
But it's yet more reasons to love Marcus.
Yeah.
For me.
So you could say, I'll give you a very simple schema for the Stoic virtues. So wisdom is really the integral virtue for a number of reasons. The Stoics think like wisdom is really the core of everything. And the other virtues are all just versions of wisdom in their approach, which they derive from Socrates. Or they think all the virtues are one. They think they're all really just different ways of framing the same thing. They argued that they didn't all believe the same thing. The Stoics disagreed with one another. But generally, following Socrates, they thought it kind of looks like, all the virtues are overlapping. They're different manifestations or aspects of wisdom. So dikaiosune, or justice and kindness, you could say, fairness, is wisdom applied to our relationships with other people and with society as a whole. And then if you're going to live, sometimes they'll say wisdom and justice are the two main virtues, because the other two virtues are ancillary to that. If you're going to live consistently in accord with wisdom and justice, that's fine. It should be a piece of cake. Apart from two things are going to trip you up. Fear and desire are going to get in the way they'll get you every time, buddy. So you're going about thinking, I'm going to be wise and just. Just like Marcus Aurelius or whatever, and then you go, well, I'm a bit scared though. So maybe I won't do this thing, or you'll think, I kind of like all this money, and I kind of like all the fame and stuff. So I'm a bit tempted just to kind of lie and think, maybe I'll kind of won't be as just as I could be, or wise, because I kind of quite like the idea of, getting all this good stuff that society's promising me. So fear and desire will tend to lead you astray. And so you think, well, what can I do about fear and desire? I'm going to need courage and temperance to deal with
Yes.
those things. So the virtues of self-mastery, so that I can live consistently in accord with wisdom and in society with justice. So the Stoic virtues are so generic, like they really just describe wisdom being applied to different aspects of human experience, essentially. That's all they map onto.
Right.
And so almost any other virtues that you can come up with are going to potentially, be subordinate to that or related to it. That's all I'd say, so clarifying your values, one way to do it is to ask yourself what qualities you want your life to stand for. Another one is to ask yourself what qualities you genuinely admire most in other people. So if you make a list of all the qualities that you admire most in historical figures, fictional characters, people that you've known personally in life, friends, family, colleagues, what are the things that you genuinely... No, some people go, I find that hard. I find occasionally with clients that go, I'm a bit nihilistic, I don't really think of value, and I don't know what my values are, super confused about it. I've been reading Jordan Peterson, and, I love the guy, but, I just feel like a bit nihilistic now and angry. Like, I don't know what my values are, all right? And so I've been on the internet looking at Andrew Tate videos, and I just come away from it feeling a bit confused and angry now, right? I don't know what to think. But I really think it's helping me, right, is what they often say. Like, so I think, well, maybe it's not, though, right? Maybe it isn't helping you. So I don't know what my values are. Okay. The first question is there, do you find anyone annoying? Oh, yeah, right. Now, funnily enough, the answer to that question is always the same in our society. And I think it might have been always the same throughout much of history. And that is the number one thing that people find most annoying are politicians, right? Every time. So you go, where'd you get annoyed with these guys on the TV? Like, what's annoying about them? They're all liars, right? They're corrupt. They're dishonest, right? Who? Joe Biden, Donald Trump. They pick their tribe, right? And then they absolutely hate this guy because he's totally dishonest. Their guy's honest, but the other guy's totally corrupt, right? It's a bit partisan in their thinking. So you say, well, hang on a minute, back up there. So so what if the guy's a little bit corrupt and dishonest? They go, but that's unacceptable, right? It sucks. It shouldn't be like that, right? You feel quite strongly about this. Yeah. Doesn't that imply that you value honesty and integrity then?
Yes.
Maybe, well, and weirdly they think about it back to front, right? They often don't really think about the positive values that they hold, even though it's kind of, many people's beliefs are written all over their faces and their behavior, right? So they spend all day going on about how they can't stand politicians. You think, I guess you guys must value integrity then, right? So what do you do about it? I mean, what efforts are you making each day to live consistently in accord with integrity and honesty yourself? Like, if you were to rate yourself 0 out of 10 for how you exhibited integrity and honesty at work, what mark would you give yourself? How many minutes or hours did you spend yesterday, the day before, doing stuff that really exemplified the virtues of honesty and integrity that you place so much value on? Now, the most common answer to that question is 0.
Oh, wow.
Right?
Yeah.
And sometimes it's more, but the majority of cases, it's 0, right? I didn't really do anything that's particular. I mean, I guess that I didn't, at least I wasn't lying all the time, but I didn't really do anything that took an effort to exhibit integrity. Nothing that I particularly took, pride in. Well, if you were increasing your score, what would you do differently? To turn the dial up, so at least, to 1 or 2 out of 10 for integrity. What would your daily routine look like? What would you have to do differently in order to if you were acting with 10 out of 10 integrity and honesty, how would your routine be different? What would you say or do differently?
Right.
What would the consequences be? How would you feel about yourself? So we're inconsistent in our values, and often we have values, but they're back to front, and hidden, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's
Yeah.
it's a bit of a dog's breakfast, right? So you go, okay, you do hate a lot of the stuff, and so that kind of implies you've got some values. You're not applying them to yourself in any.
Mm-hmm.
Like Socrates knew, Socrates would very clearly have exactly the same conversation with people 2,000 years ago, 2,300, 400, 2,400 years ago. And yet today we still find people are consuming all this self-help stuff, but they've never often just thought about these very basic questions. Seneca said, if you don't know to which port you're sailing, then no wind is favourable, right? Which is a kind of polite way of saying, if you don't even know what it is that you're trying to achieve, then, for instance, self-help would be pointless, because what is it that you're actually helping yourself to do? What's the goal? Helping yourself implies that you're helping yourself to become something or to achieve something, right?
Right.
Like, it's a pathway to get you there. Get you where? No idea. Like, so how do you know that you're not just heading in completely the wrong direction? That's crazy, Donald. How can you possibly say that? Well, how many people are there out there that use Stoicism as a way of becoming more productive at work? Like, they use, I'm using Stoicism to help me kind of like appear more confident, like, because I want to, achieve like more success on the internet or something like that. Like, so often people see self-help techniques, but they're using them to achieve goals that aren't even really their own authentic goals and values.
So you not only have to think about your values, but you also think about the goals, and that's
goals that are consistent with your values,
consistent
though.
with
Not
your
goals
values.
that replace your values. See, there's a difference between saying, I want to make a lot of money. Okay, why do you want to make a lot of money? I can't remember. I don't know. It just seems like everyone else is doing it.
Seemed like a good idea at the time.
Seemed like a good idea at the time, right. So hang on a minute. Like, you want to make a lot of money because it's important to you to be the kind of person that's responsible and a good father and a good husband, and to look after your family, right? Is that maybe why you're making money? I forgot about that, right? But so you take this promotion at work because it makes me more money, right? Yeah. But it means that you don't spend any time with your family now.
Right.
Well, that's true, right? But there's kind of contradiction there, right? Because the whole reason that you were trying to make more money in the first place was because you wanted to have more quality time and like be a good father and stuff like that. But it's doing the opposite, right? So sometimes when we lose sight of why we're doing stuff, we end up like pursuing our goals in a way that's self-defeating and completely contrary to our values. What does it benefit you, Meredith, if you gain the whole effing world but lose your soul in the process?
That's right.
Right? That's essentially the point that the Stoics are making. Like, what does it matter if you achieve these external goals, but you're sacrificing wisdom, you're sacrificing arete, like virtue, in the process of doing it? You're destroying yourself and your values in order to like achieve these things that are really superficial, the external. These external advantages, the Socrates, everything the Stoics say really, a large part of their virtue ethic is derived from an argument. Like, one of the problems with ancient philosophy is a lot of times they're taking for granted arguments that are very familiar in the ancient world, and that modern readers maybe aren't as familiar with.
Right.
So, and that they hear the same arguments over and over again from different schools of philosophy. So one of them is very well stated in the Euthydemus in Plato, where Socrates is talking to a young guy, and he says, "How would you define good fortune?" basically. And so he's basically saying, like the goal of life or flourishing, like what makes somebody fortunate, like. And he says, usually Socrates asks an easy question, and then he follows up with a much more difficult question. So everyone thought he was an idiot. They talk a lot about how he said, "You're like a child, Socrates, with your stupid questions about sheep," right? And stuff like Socrates used to go around asking people, does a shepherd know how many sheep he has? And people were like, that's a stupid question. Like, if you're an ancient Athenian shepherd, you have like one job, and that's to count the sheep and make sure you don't lose one, right? So
Right.
you're pretty adept at counting sheep. And so the answer to that sort of would be yes, shepherds know how many sheep they have. And then Socrates says, oh, that's interesting. You go like, what's more important, friends or sheep? And they'd be like, okay, this guy's nuts, right? You
Yeah.
weirdo. Like, well, I mean, I'm kind of stuck here. Like, so, like, I mean, I've got to ask these dumb acts. So, like, well, friends are more important than sheep, Socrates, right? And Socrates would say, how many friends have you got? And they'd be like, I don't know. I haven't ever stopped to count them. Like, and Socrates would say, you said friends are more important than sheep, right? And they'd be like, yeah, obviously. And a shepherd would know how many sheep he's got, and they'd be like, yeah, what are you saying? And but I guess, like, you're not really acting like you think friends are more important than sheep. But you said that you're totally convinced that they are. And they'd be like, you know what, screw you. Like,
Very awkward
and,
questions. I mean,
yeah, and they'd get mad at him,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
But in the Euthydemus, he says, you know, what's the most important thing in life? And Euthydemus says, well, stuff like having a lot of money,
yeah.
obviously, you know, status, noble birth, having a good family, having a beautiful wife, big house, like in a flash car in ancient Athens, like a fancy chariot, I guess. Like, you know, a nice suit of armor, like, you know, all that kind of stuff, right? And oh yeah, like maybe, you know, character, like having wisdom and integrity and courage and stuff like that. And so Socrates says, well, that sounds like a good answer, right? I think a lot of people would agree with you. I think the guy's called Cleinias, but his name doesn't matter. So I think a lot of people would agree with you. He said, but just one thing. He's like Columbo, Socrates. Like, just one more thing.
Right.
He goes, but just one more thing.
Right.
He said, like, suppose you got a big pile of money, right? And we gave it to somebody who was wise and virtuous. How would that pan out? They'd be like, well, that'd be awesome. Like, you'd be able to do a lot of wise and virtuous things with that big pile of money, right? And Socrates is like, you're right. It seems like a good thing, right? But just one more thing, right? What if we got this big pile of money and we gave it to somebody who was foolish and vicious? Well, I mean, I guess that they do a lot more foolish and vicious things. But like, I mean, like someone winning the lottery and suddenly they're surrounded by hangers-on and they blow it all, and cigarettes and whiskey and wild women or whatever it is people spend money on, right? And Socrates was like, okay, they would just do the foolish things with the money. So maybe the money just gives you more control over your environment and other people. And so it kind of allows you to do more things. But whether that's good or bad would depend on whether you use it well or use it badly. So whether you use it wisely or foolishly. So what would matter would be the way that you use the thing. And the thing is like an external advantage. It gives you more control over life. But that's not necessarily a good thing in itself. It's neutral. And the use that you make of it would be what matters. And Cleinias says, okay, maybe you've got a point. And so then Socrates says, spoiler alert, because that's a thing that people used to say in ancient. Not a lot of people know that.
Sure,
but that's the thing they used to say back in the day.
The origin
so spoiler alert, yeah, the origin of it. He said, this is true of all of the other things that you mentioned as well. So even having lots of friends or status or big house and stuff like that, like whether they're good or bad depends on whether you are wise or foolish and the use that you make of them. And he says, I'll tell you something else, and you're not going to believe me when I say this. This might shock you. But actually, if you were wise, if you were foolish, then potentially you'd never make good use of anything, right? Maybe you use everything, every opportunity you'd use badly in life. If you took a big pile of money and you gave it to an evil dictator, maybe like anything that you give to him that's an advantage you'd use badly. But if you're wise and courageous and self-disciplined, maybe you use everything well. So even poverty and even disrepute might be things that you could potentially use wisely. Like you could learn from them, study them and adapt to them and grow stronger and more resilient as a result and stuff like that, right? You know, like maybe somebody's really wise and really virtuous, they actually benefit from adversity, crazy as that may sound, right? And so that very quickly seems to really it brings about an epistrophe, like a radical reversal or a U-turn in the way that we normally think about our values. And that's the foundation of Stoic virtue ethics.
Yes,
If you
yes.
ask me what's the most important, I think, aspect of Stoicism that people don't understand today, and the part that I would practice all day long by carrying around a little
Yeah.
stone that reminds me to turn around and think more about the way that I'm making use of my experiences. That's the point that he was making. The Stoics kind of take that for granted. Stoicism is like a bullet point version of the Socratic dialogues. Like they don't. There are bits of argument in Stoicism, but generally they're assuming these arguments have already been made.
Yes, yes.
So that's why I think people that are interested in Stoicism should read Xenophon and Plato as well.
Right, right. And of course, your book on Socrates.
And my book, which is available from all good bookshops and some bad ones.
Yeah.
And
every
single copy that I sell of that, did you know, I make so much money. If somebody buys a copy of that book, it allows me to buy half a cup of coffee in Starbucks from the royalties from that alone.
Wow.
So
we got to support your coffee habit. Yeah.
Yeah, rush out now.
Rush out now.
Get yourself a copy.
But seriously, this has been so much food for thought. As always, when I talk to you, Donald, I have learned so much. I loved this discussion about values, virtues, psychology, everything else. And how do folks follow your work in addition to that book? How do you invite people to learn about what you do and your work?
Well, they could just Google me. Right, these days, or they mostly. I was interviewed by Sam Harris a while back, and then he said something really surprising in the middle of the interview. He said that although he spent many years studying Tibetan Buddhism and this neuropsychology of mindfulness and stuff, the single behavioral change that he thinks has had the biggest tangible impact on his quality of life was deleting Twitter from his phone.
Wow!
Right,
wow!
And I believe him. Right. So stick that in your pipe and smoke it. So you won't find me on Twitter.
Okay.
Because, I think it's got a little bit out of control as a propaganda machine, like, basically. It's like not a healthy environment. Right. But Substack, I tend to spend more time on. So, like, I have videos and a podcast and articles and stuff like that. Most of the stuff that I do is on Substack now.
Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you again, Donald, for joining me today. It's been a great discussion, and see you again next time.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thanks very much, Meredith.
Thank you.